Welcome back. In my most recent video, I made scallion oil out of 3 onions that had sprouted in my cupboard, and today I'd like to use the oil I have left to make an extremely flavorful onion mayonnaise. And just so you know, I'm not kidding that this stuff is quite tasty. If you're planning to follow along, you'll need about a cup of neutral oil, a couple of room temperature eggs, an immersion blender, a container that's only slightly wider than the head of your immersion blender, and an acid of your choice to help with emulsification. I'm also using about a tablespoon of all day onions, which you should have a container of in your freezer if you watched my video on how to make them. They don't really serve a purpose in the recipe outside of flavor, so if you don't have any, just leave them out. I'd like to take a moment to talk about each ingredient, what purpose they serve in the recipe, and some alternative options for people who might prefer using different oils or different acids. If you're enjoying the video, it'd mean a lot to me if you press the like button, and if you'd like more content similar to this in your feed, don't forget to subscribe for more homemade food. Technically, mayonnaise can be made with just egg yolks and oil, and any other ingredients that you add could be considered as extras. But with that in mind, let's talk about the extras I'll be adding. A little bit of acid can play a role in denaturing the proteins found in eggs. Naturally, the proteins are kind of a long, loopy knot shape, and a little bit of acid can help untangle and unwind them into individual strands. When the proteins are tied up in a ball, it makes it much more difficult for them to bond with other ingredients and to emulsify. Think of it like trying to tie your shoes. If your laces were full of knots, you're going to have a much harder time tying them together than you would if they were straightened out first. And the same thing applies here. The type of acid you use doesn't really matter, and it just comes down to what kind of flavors you're looking for. If you like a mayo that has a tangy, slightly sour zip, you can use a little lemon juice. If you like the flavors of yellow, Dijon, or German mustard, those work perfectly fine too. And if none of that suits you, you can achieve similar results with a lot of different acidic ingredients, like horseradish or garlic. I don't usually measure mine, but if this is your first time making mayonnaise, start with maybe a tablespoon of your acidic ingredient per egg, or a little bit less if you're using vinegar. In my case, I'm trying to make a mayonnaise that accentuates the flavors of my scallion oil, so I'm going to use white vinegar since it won't change the flavor of my other ingredients. Onto the oil, you can pretty much use any neutral oil you want, but I'm going to say something controversial, and I know I'm going to catch hell in the comments over this, but don't use olive oil. Hear me out. Olive oil can become very acrid and bitter if you whip it with an immersion blender or a food processor. The more you blend it, the more polyphenols will break free and disperse through the oil, and the worse it's going to taste. If you don't believe me, feel free to try it for yourself, but don't blame me if you end up throwing out the resulting oxidized tasting mayonnaise. If you're dead set on olive oil mayonnaise, you're probably going to have to settle for store-bought or use a combination of olive oil and something else. From what I've been able to find, most store-bought olive oil mayonnaise uses olive oil mixed with either canola or soybean oil. I encourage you to experiment with a combination of different oils, but for today, I'm using canola. If you're looking for my suggestions for alternative oils, I've had pretty good success in the past with grapeseed, avocado, and sunflower. The other ingredient we need to talk about is eggs. I like the results that I get with 2 whole eggs, but technically 1 yolk should be enough to emulsify several liters of oil. Most recipes call for just the yolks, but there are some pros and cons to separating them. Using just the yolks will give you a more rich mayonnaise, and you'll have less issue with it being too thin or separating. The obvious downside is now you have to figure out what to do with 1 to 2 egg whites. Personally, I almost never find use for my leftover egg whites, so I just don't bother separating them. But I also don't mind a slightly thinner mayonnaise. I've never had this recipe break or split on me, but if yours does, don't panic. Just add 1 egg yolk to your broken mayonnaise, reprocess it with an immersion blender, and everything should come together perfectly. The other benefit of using a whole egg is that there's a little bit of water in the egg whites. Now, while this might sound counterintuitive, you do need a certain amount of water content in your mayonnaise for it to be able to, well, become mayonnaise. This recipe uses the water found in the egg whites and vinegar for that purpose, but if you were to only use yolks and substitute the acid for something with less water content, like mustard powder or something, you may find that you need to actually add a tiny bit of water to achieve the right texture. Egg whites do freeze pretty well, so if you really want to separate your eggs and just use the yolks, you could start a container in your freezer and use the egg whites for meringues or egg white omelets as needed. Up to you. A lot of recipes online will overcomplicate this process and say that you have to slowly drizzle in the oil while the blender's running, or that you can't move or lift the blender once you've started. I've tried all the different methods and techniques that I could find, and I can tell you from experience, this method gave me the exact same results with a lot less fuss. Put all of your ingredients into the container, then fill it with oil so that everything is submerged and sitting at the bottom. Place your immersion blender in and tilt it to the side to make sure that there's no trapped air bubbles, then move it to the bottom of the container and turn it on. Keep it pretty close to the bottom of the container until you start seeing mayonnaise form. Now, ideally the blender will draw the oil from the top layer down and mix it in, but most times I do find I need to raise and lower it slightly. The key here is that you do not want to lift it so far that it sucks in a whole bunch of air. You just want to move it up and down enough to draw the oil from the top layer down and help everything combine. Keep mixing until it's all one consistent color and all the oil is combined with the rest of the ingredients. And congratulations, you now have mayonnaise. This should keep for up to about a week in the fridge, so be sure to use it fairly quickly. If you want a mayonnaise that'll last longer in the fridge, you need to use pasteurized eggs, and doing so should keep it food safe for closer to 2 to 3 weeks. I'll be making a video sooner than later on how to pasteurize your eggs to make things like food safe cookie dough, so be sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that one. The short version is you need to keep them at a constant temperature for an amount of time that will kill the pathogens that they could be harboring, and in the case of eggs that's usually salmonella. Using a sous vide and keeping them around 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 minutes to an hour should do the trick. Some of you might be thinking to yourself, wait, what would I even do with onion mayonnaise? And a personal favorite of mine is the onion grilled cheese, Hold the Onions. Better the next day, but delicious, nonetheless. Into the fridge it goes. You should know by now that I love the taste of onions, but I'm not a big fan of biting into onions when I'm eating my food. And if that sounds familiar, you're gonna love this one. If you'd like to see a deep dive into making the perfect grilled cheese, let me know in the comments. But for today, I'm using store-bought white bread and sliced marble cheddar cheese. I'd like to tell you that there are no wrong ways to make a grilled cheese, but I think we've all seen that Gordon Ramsay video where he burns the bread black and doesn't even manage to melt his cheese, so clearly there is an objective wrong way to do this. Let's talk about the right way. As with most things, I like to start with a cold cast iron pan. This lets me control the temperature more easily, and it means that I can take my time and assemble the sandwich at my leisure instead of burning myself or the bottom layer of the bread trying to rush. I prefer sliced cheese to grated because I don't have to worry about any falling out of the sandwich and into the pan and getting a little crispy, but if you like crispy cheese around the edges, go right ahead and use grated. I'm adding a generous layer of onion mayonnaise to the outside of both slices of bread, assembling it in the pan, and then cooking it low and slow for about 8 minutes, flipping it whenever I feel like it. The result is an unassuming grilled cheese that looks totally plain, but has an almost overpowering fried onion flavor. I made this one with just cheese to show you the basics, but generally if I'm making the sandwich, I like a couple slices of ham inside, and maybe just a little hint of sriracha or Dijon mustard. As long as you cook it low and slow enough to fully melt the cheese while getting a nice toasty golden brown on the outside, there's no real wrong answers here. By the way, here's a little peek behind the curtain for anyone who's watched to the end. Have you ever wondered how YouTubers always seem to have a perfect cheese pull for their videos? Let me show you how it's done. Take the 2 halves of your grilled cheese while it's still nice and warm and press them together. Squeeze very slightly to move some of the cheese from the outside towards the middle, then slide the 2 halves back and forth 2 or 3 times to get really good cheese-on-cheese contact. Now pull them apart slowly and watch the magic. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more homemade food. See you next time.